My name is Catherine Peel. I'm the Eastern Ontario Rights of Ways Habitat Coordinator at Canadian Wildlife Federation. And I'm happy to welcome you today to the third and final webinar of our winter webinar series for 2026. And we'll be joined today by Lily Charles for a webinar on habitat restoration for monarch. I'll start with a land acknowledgement. So today I'm joining this webinar from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And the Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this territory. And I encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge the land from which you're joining from today. And if you're unfamiliar or would like a refresher, I invite you to visit this website, which will be shared in the chat, to take a look at the territories across this country and find where you might be the traditional lands from which you're joining from today. Just some housekeeping items before we get started. As usual, feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, let us know where you're joining from, and if you have any technical problems, our team will be in the chat helping sort that out as needed. If you have any questions for Lily during the presentation, you can use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. And if you're having any problems with audio, make sure to check the audio settings and just confirm that you've set up with the correct speakers. Just a few engagement guidelines for today to encourage a respectful and useful webinar for everyone. Engage as much as you're comfortable and feel free to inquire and share in the chat or in the Q&A throughout the presentation. If you're using any technical terms or acronyms, just be sure to clarify their meaning to ensure common understanding. Always assume good intent. We're all here to learn and share knowledge. And so be curious and disagree respectfully if you disagree about anything, and be mindful of your question comment length so that we can engage with as many people as possible in the Q&A portion. And my final item before we get to the webinar is to share some helpful links. So the first QR code on the left here will take you to last month's recording of the winter webinar, and also to the playlist where we have the previous webinars from 2026 winter webinar series and before that. And then the link on the right is an upcoming event that we have in Vancouver in May. It's the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group Binational meeting with Canada and the US. And I invite you to take a look at the link and join us there for the event. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce Lily Charles, a master's student in the Meadow Mosaic Lab at the University of Ottawa. And I'm especially excited for today's webinar because Lily and I worked together in the lab for a few months while I was finishing my master's and while she was starting hers. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the results from her research on monarch habitat use on restored lands. So I'll pass it off to you now, Lily.
Awesome. Oh, there's a bit of an echo. Just gonna share my screen. I'm not sure if it's coming from your end, Catherine. I'm hearing my voice echoed back.
Try now. I'll try to mute myself and see if that helps.
Okay, are you able to see my screen? Okay, slides are good. Awesome. Start from the top. All right. Thank you all so much for joining me here today. I'm super excited to discuss my projects that I've been working on with myself and collaborators about habitat restoration for monarchs, specifically how and where should we be doing restoration as part of the CWF Winter Webinar Series. Just a bit of background before I get going on the talk. As Catherine said, my name is Lily Charles. I'm a second-year master's student in the Meadow Mosaic Lab, co-supervised by Heather Karuba, and then Greg Mitchell, who's a research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And the research that I'm doing is also in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So a bit of background for this project, these projects that I'll be discussing. As I'm sure most of you likely know, the monarch butterfly was recently listed by the Government of Canada under the Federal Species at Risk Act as endangered in 2023. And a primary threat to the monarch butterfly is the loss of breeding habitat and nectar resources, and specifically focusing on their critical habitat in the summer breeding range around southern Ontario. There is a loss of habitat, and so this means that restoration efforts for their habitat are key. So how can we want to know through this research, how can we help inform restoration strategies? So how and where should we be restoring habitat to support the monarch butterfly and then hopefully other pollinators in turn? So today I'm going to be talking about these two main questions. So the first is, how should we be restoring monarch habitat? And to get into this, I'll be discussing part of my master's thesis where I have looked at meadows that were restored by the Nature Conservancy of Canada in Southern Ontario to understand are these effective restoration projects, and then also how do local habitat characteristics in these restored sites influence monarchs. And then for the second overarching question of where should we be restoring monarch habitat, I have two projects to talk about. So the first is another part of my master's thesis where we are investigating how different landscape factors such as grassland habitat amount and the level of habitat fragmentation will affect monarch abundance, as well as the tagging study that we've done to track migration routes and identify critical habitat along the migration path for monarchs. So I'll get started with the first section of how should we restore monarch habitat by talking about the Norfolk County Restoration Study. So to set the stage, this map to the left shows the study region in Southern Ontario indicated by the white box, so it's close to the shore of Lake Erie. And within this region, the Nature Conservancy of Canada has restored grassland and meadow habitat. This region is part of the Lake Erie lowland sub-ecoregion, as a part of the greater mixed wood plains ecoregion. And this is formerly a location with prairies and savannas native to Canada, but now only 14% of the natural land cover actually remains. And agricultural and urban land use cover 67% of this ecoregion. So the Nature Conservancy of Canada's goal was to restore native grasslands, improve biodiversity, and provide pollinator habitat in this area. So they have taken former agricultural properties, such as the one shown here on the left, and they have restored them through seeding and other measures to, these are images from these restored properties from the fieldwork that I did. And the questions in this study were developed with the Nature Conservancy of Canada to understand how monarchs are using their restored habitats and also to better inform future restoration projects that they do. So this shaped our main question of how is monarch butterfly abundance influenced by local restored habitat characteristics. So more specifically, nectar resources, patch size, and milkweed resources were factors that we were interested in. So among these restored sites in the Nature Conservancy of Canada properties, we wanted to select sites to maximize the variation in restored patch size to get at this question that we were curious about, while also minimizing the difference in year of restoration. These yellow points on the map indicate selected restored sites out of all the green restoration properties. And the sites that we ended up selecting were ranged between 0.4 to about 20 hectares, and they were restored between 2017 and 2022. Some sites restored by the Nature Conservancy of Canada have had controlled burns, but we decided to select unburned sites to keep it consistent. But in the future, investigating the effect of controlled burns in these sites would also be an interesting question. In the end, we had 15 sites in total, and we visited them 3 times throughout the season. The butterfly surveys that we conducted were based on pollard walk surveys, as indicated by this diagram here to the right. So we set 3 100-meter transects in each site. There were some smaller sites, such as the 0.4 hectare site, that were too small to actually fit these 3 transects, so we set one 100-meter transect. However, all sites, the transects were surveyed along for the same 60-minute period. And so in these surveys, the observers recorded all foraging butterflies within 5 meters of the transect line. And these observations included the butterfly species that was observed, as well as the flowering plant species from which they were observed foraging. To quantify the vegetation and the floral resources, as well as milkweed resources within the sites, we set 10 randomized quadrats along the foraging survey transects, and we recorded the number of flowering units for each species, as well as measured the flowering unit area. So we could use the floral area to estimate floral resource density at each site. And we also counted milkweed stems and recorded the species as well to get milkweed density metric. From these butterfly surveys, we observed a total of 477 butterfly foraging observations across all sites over the season. And these were from 178 unique butterflies. So there were several butterflies that we observed foraging from multiple different flowers within the survey period. And butterflies were from 18 different species or species groups, as shown below. We had recorded 173 monarch foraging observations from 67 unique monarchs, and monarchs were observed foraging in all of the 15 restored sites surveyed, which is great news for these restoration projects in terms of supporting monarchs. Throughout the sites, we observed 42 different flowering plant species and 3 species of milkweeds that were available. And so the images here are some of the most frequent observations of flowering plant species that we saw throughout the sites. Now getting back to our original target research questions about different local site characteristics that might influence monarch abundance, we found that there were positive relationships between monarch abundance and site area and milkweed density, so that's milkweed stem count. And although there is a weaker relationship with site area here, this kind of lets us know that site size should be considered when planning restoration projects, aiming to restore larger patches when possible. But also, since monarchs were observed foraging in all of these patches, no matter the size, this tells us that restoring sites of all sizes is valuable. And from the milkweed density analysis, planting high densities of milkweed at restoration sites is key to attract monarchs and support their breeding. So of course we know that monarchs need milkweed, but this is sort of quantifying that and letting us know that restored sites that do have more milkweed did generally have more monarchs. And we also found with the rest of the butterfly surveys that we did, total butterfly abundance was positively influenced by flowering species richness. So there were more butterflies when there were a higher number of floral resource species within a site. So that's also important for informing restoration projects as well. So to summarize this section, these restoration projects done by the Nature Conservancy of Canada are successful restoration projects that are being used by monarchs and several other butterfly species for nectar foraging. From these results, we suggest to prioritize larger restoration areas, but all restoration is important. And from this, we can see that all restoration patches were being used. Milkweed is key, so remembering to plant high densities as well as many species of milkweed, and to plant many flowering plant species to support the greater butterfly community as well. So moving on to our second overarching question of where should we restore monarch habitat, I'm going to be talking about the landscape study that I'm working on also as a part of my master's thesis. So there are 2 different monitoring programs, the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program and Mission Monarch Expert, that have standardized protocols to quantify monarch, milkweed, and nectar plant data from various land use types and regions across North America. And the aim of both of these programs is to monitor monarchs and characterize habitats. And both use similar standardized protocols. The IMMP is run by Monarch Joint Venture in the US, and Mission Monarch Expert is the Canadian counterpart. And there are standardized protocols available for use in other potential monitoring projects. So the aim of these programs is to help track long-term changes in the distribution and abundance of monarchs and their habitats to inform effective conservation measures. And conservation professionals and community scientists are also invited to take part in this initiative. And the diagrams below here illustrate the sampling methods that are used for some of these surveys to set up the Monarch survey transects on the left. And then on the right is the protocol for conducting milkweed and blooming plant surveys. So following a similar process as the previous project that I talked about, just slightly different methods. And these sites are randomly selected for surveying based on the GRITS, or the Generalized Random Tessellation Systematic Sampling Framework. So this is random selection at two different levels. So 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer blocks were randomly placed across Canada. And then points within these randomly selected blocks were also randomly selected based on their land cover type. So the aim is to not only be surveying from locations where it is likely that a monarch would be found, like a meadow, but to be surveying from many different locations and randomize the land cover that you're surveying from. So with this project that I'm working on, I've combined these two large data sets for a total of 9 years of monarch survey data from 2017 to 2025. And this provides monarch abundance data as well. So this is the counts for the monarch. To answer this overarching question of how do landscape features influence monarch abundance? So more specifically, we are interested in how does the amount of grassland habitat in the landscape affect monarchs, and how does habitat fragmentation within a landscape affect monarchs? So for this project, we've chosen to focus on the critical breeding season habitat for monarchs. So to the left is a map of the Center for Environmental Cooperation's level 2 ecoregions, and we have selected the ecoregion 8.1. So this is the Mixedwood Plains ecoregion, which includes parts of southeastern Canada and northeastern United States. There were thousands of surveys conducted across North America as a part of both of these monitoring programs, but specifically within this selected study region, there are 1,102 surveys conducted that are included in this analysis. To quantify land cover variables, I'm using the Dynamic World land cover land use maps. So Dynamic World is a global scale raster available on Google Earth Engine, and these rasters have 10-meter resolution, and they also have 9 classes initially, and I have manually added roads to the raster as another class using road networks from OpenStreetMaps, which are available publicly. To define a landscape, this is the buffer around each survey site from these programs that were conducted. And we have chosen to look at landscapes ranging from 1 kilometer. So this map to the right here shows 1 kilometer radii landscapes around these survey sites up to 12 kilometers, because 12 kilometers is the average monarch birth to death movement distance during the breeding season. And so more specifically, we will be quantifying habitat amount. So this is defined as the percent of grass cover in the landscape, and habitat fragmentation, which is defined as the number of grass patches per kilometer in the landscape, also known as patch density. And so this project is currently in progress. I'm actively working on analyzing this data, so the results are still to come. But this could help inform what kind of landscapes habitat results or habitat should be restored in, and there could be many interpretations of the results, whether there is a positive relationship with grass amount or even fragmentation in the landscape, or whether there's a negative impact that can inform where we should be restoring other habitat based on these factors. And for the final project that I will be talking about, also as a part of this overarching question of where should we restore monarch habitat, I will be talking about the tagging study that we did. So this was also back to Southern Ontario around the shoreline of Lake Erie. So this habitat is important for monarchs as it is part of the summer breeding range, but is also a staging area. So this is where monarchs congregate before they fly further southward on their migration. And we were curious about where monarchs go after they leave these sites along the north shore of Lake Erie on their southward migration. So are they funneling along the Lake Erie shoreline, or are they flying directly across the lake? And knowing this can help inform where we should be restoring and conserving habitat around this region. And to answer this question, we were working with blue morpho Bluetooth tags on the butterflies. So in 2024, we previously had tagged 39 monarchs with the previous generation of blue morpho tags. So these tags are able to be detected with specialized receiver equipment, such as this monitoring tower in the image to the right. And one of these was, or sorry, two of these were set up at the tip of Long Point, which is shown in the map to the left. And so these can detect when a monarch flies by the receiver and can help inform which direction the butterfly is flying. And if there are multiple receivers set up, it can kind of give a overarching general path of where the butterfly is flying. However, this past fall, we tagged another 50 with the previous generation of Blue Morpho tags, but we also tagged 30 monarchs with the novel Blue Morpho Plus tags, which function more as an air tag or Find My Friends would, where they are able to be passively detected by any Bluetooth device in the surroundings within detection distance. So rather than needing specialized towers set up to monitor the monarchs or having handheld devices, monitoring devices to detect these butterflies, they are able to be detected throughout their pathway by phones, by cars. So it's able to provide a much clearer path of where the monarchs are migrating, which has not been previously possible in this same way. And so on this slide here, this is from starting in last September in 2025 and shows monarchs that we tagged, but also all of the other monarchs that have been tagged across the continent with these Blue Morpho Plus tags. And you can see the path of their migration, which is really fascinating, and seeing them collectively change direction at points could suggest that there are different factors impacting their migration, but this is the most clear picture of their migration we've been able to see, which I find very, very fascinating. And to get back to the original question of are they flying across Lake Erie from Long Point, or are they going more around the shoreline? There were many monarchs that did cross directly from Long Point that we tagged earlier on in September that you can see here as they start at Long Point and then they cross over the lake and are detected on the other side by other Bluetooth devices. However, later on, there were monarchs that were tagged that flew from Long Point back around the shoreline, and some of them funneled across other peninsulas on the lake, but some of them continued on around the whole shoreline. So this means that all habitat surrounding Lake Erie is important for migrating monarchs. So this tells us that it is important to conserve and restore habitats surrounding the Great Lakes and provide nectar resources for migrating monarchs that are stopping as they cross over the lakes and also as they make their way around the lakes as well. And I just wanted to take some time to talk about the Project Monarch app, which is publicly available and provides really, really interesting snapshots of the monarchs as they travel on their migration. So you can see in this figure in the middle, these are all of the monarchs that have been tagged with both the previous generation of blue morpho tags, but also the novel blue morpho plus tags as well. And the image to the right shows the path of one of these migrating monarchs. So you can see from these detection points sort of where it has traveled across the continent, which is really fascinating for understanding where is the most critical habitat and to create restoration projects. And so to summarize the experiences and the findings that we've had from these tags, the previous generation of blue morpho tags was really only able to be detected by these custom receivers, such as the receiving tower or handheld receivers. But we found that the stationary towers were more effective for location-specific studies. So if they are flying, for example, through a habitat patch that you're curious about, the stationary receivers would be ideal. Or if they're flying in a certain direction that you're curious about, the receivers would also be ideal for that. However, the Blue Morpho Plus tags give a far clearer picture of the butterfly flight path without relying on active detection methods and can be picked up by any Bluetooth devices. So they're excellent for studying the migration or for identifying key habitat areas along the pathway. So you can detect them flying over these areas. And it's important to note that these do still rely on other Bluetooth devices in the surrounding area to be detected. So in more rural areas, there might not be as high of detection probabilities, but this would be a great situation to have these stationary towers to detect the monarchs as they fly by to sort of fill in those gaps. So some takeaways from these three projects that I have summarized. So first, for how should we be restoring monarch habitat? It is important to focus on increasing milkweed density from the results that we found and to prioritize restoring large habitat patches. However, all restored habitat, no matter the size, is beneficial for monarchs. And for the second question of where should we be restoring monarch habitat, some of the results are still to come, but landscape ecology and Bluetooth tagging methods can help create more targeted restoration projects by identifying locations where restored habitat would be most beneficial for monarchs. Thank you all so much for listening to my talk. And I'd like to thank everyone who has helped out in this process and all of the contributors who have helped along in this research and who have helped with funding. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Lily. That was amazing. Let me turn this on. There's a few questions in the chat, and I have some more questions too, so I might ask my questions if there's time at the end. So I'll start actually with the first two. They're related. So the first question is about the amount of milkweed from your first portion of the presentation. So is there a limit to the amount of milkweed we can plant close together? Are very large patches of densely planted milkweed okay, or should we intersperse other species if you're thinking about doing the restoration?
I would say the more milkweed, the better. I think there are some studies out there that have looked at sort of like how to configure plantings. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but planting, yeah, I think there are definitely some studies out there, but I would say focus on if you can have high densities of milkweed, that's great. And if you can plant more species, because we did see monarchs foraging from all species and also laying eggs on all species. So yeah, I would say plant as many species as possible, but there are definitely resources out there that have more clear answers.
Okay, perfect. And then this question is related to that as well. The second question about the ideal density of milkweed. When you say high density, aim for a high density, what density would you consider a high density? In terms of, I guess, like how many milkweed seeds in the rest of the milkweed seeds if you're doing restoration, or by area? Do you have an idea?
I can go back. I would say translating this back from the restoration efforts, because we have sort of like the final finished restored habitats, translating that back to the amount of seeding that was done is maybe a little bit on the trickier side. But in terms of higher density, we found that it was like the highest milkweed stem counts were around 25, and that was 25 stems uh, per meter squared, I believe. And so that was the site that had the most monarchs observed as well. So aiming for something like that, but yeah.
Okay, great. Um, I'm gonna ask my question because I think it fits in well in this time. Do you have an idea of the seeds that were used in the restoration? So you found 42 different flowering plant species and 3 species of milkweed, I think you said. Is that
Yeah.
close to what was used in the seed mixes for the restoration? Do you know? I know it was done before you started the
Yeah,
research.
there are records of the seeding that was done, but it varied a lot by site. And so generally, we do have data on like the overall vegetation communities that hopefully we're looking at some point, comparing to the previous seeding mix. But generally, like there were a few invasive species that we did observe as well that weren't obviously in the restored
Mhm.
mixes. Um, but yeah.
Okay, great. The next question is about the monarchs in that same portion of the presentation. So you mentioned that total monarch count was related to site size, but if you look at it in terms of monarch density, i.e. number per area, is there still a relationship with site size, i.e. per area, are the smaller areas as good?
Sorry, so monarch density as in like the number of monarchs per 1 meter squared or something like
Right,
that?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think we controlled for the number of transects that we used in the models for this as well, but um, we have for each of the sites for the foraging surveys, it's just the number of monarchs per site that were observed. So uh, we wouldn't really be able to get like a density metric from like exact points where the monarchs were observed, but yeah.
Okay. And then moving on to the landscape study, were there any reason for the lower amount of studies in the eastern provinces, even though the area is included in the ecoregion?
The reason for that, I meant to mention it, I'm not sure if I did mention it, but the Mission Monarch expert surveys were actually only conducted in Ontario and Quebec so far, so they've only been um, conducted since 2023, I believe. So the program is more recent compared to the US program that's been running. So yeah, it's just a matter of timing and resources.
Okay, perfect. And then moving on to the final, so the monarch tagging. Next question, what is the energy cost to the monarch of carrying the tag? And has increased mortality among tagged monarchs been noticed?
So because this is very recent, the increased mortality, I'm not sure if anyone has specifically looked at that, but the tag does weigh around 0.05 milligrams, I believe. Not sure if the milligram versus gram, but it is less than 5% of the monarch's body weight. So um, yeah, it would be the equivalent of having a smaller weight sort of strapped to your back. So it could impact them, but scientifically it is within that range of the.
Right. And the natural variation between monarch
Yeah, and we did,
tags as well.
yeah, as we were tagging them, we did measure them and weigh them to ensure that they were all um, would have been capable of carrying the tags as well, and ensure that wing condition was in good shape based
Right.
on like the level of fading of the wings and also wing damage. So monarchs that had brighter colors and no damage to wings.
Right. That makes sense. Is there a difference in the generations of the tags between last year and this year, or are they similar tags in terms of like size and shape?
They functionally are exactly the same tag. They look the same. It's the same hardware, but it's just the software of the previous ones can only be detected with the specific detection
Mhm.
devices versus the new ones have that Bluetooth detection capability.
Okay. Do monarchs wander very far from their place of birth before migration begins? I guess in the context of the tracking, is there benefit to tagging and tracking them before migration?
Generally, I mentioned this at one point, but there have been studies on where it's about like the 12-kilometer birth to death distance for a monarch during the breeding season. So they do move around. There would definitely be benefits to tagging them before they leave for migration if you're interested in actually identifying what patches they're using or where they're flying around. But yeah, I think it depends on your question if you're looking at more finer scale habitat stuff versus if you're only curious really about how they're like the path that they're taking on migration, then it would make sense to tag them like as they're leaving for their fall migration. So from staging areas such as Long Point, which is where we tag them from.
Right. Okay, perfect. This is again for the migration study. So have any of your findings from the migration study on Lake Erie indicated characteristics of ideal habitat across the Monarch Range? So this person works for a municipality and much of the habitat they have available for restoration is an intermix of urban-suburban fragments. So is it wise to create monarch habitat in the urban areas where monarchs might be exposed to risks or might have big gaps between habitat types?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a clear answer for that. But I would say there is benefits to restoring habitat no matter what, although you have to be careful of creating an ecological trap if you're restoring habitat in areas where monarchs are more likely to be hit by cars or at risk from other issues. Um, but yeah, I don't have as clear of an answer for that at this point.
Okay. Do monarchs moving from Eastern Ontario cross predominantly around Long Point, or do some cross earlier, for example, at the west end of Lake Ontario?
They generally, I would say they move towards these staging areas at the peninsulas, like we sort of saw the funneling along Long Point and then along Rondo, that other point there as well. I would think that there would be some crossing at other points because we are seeing that they are crossing directly across the lake from Long Point. But yeah, this is sort of like first proof that they're just going directly across the lake.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Yeah, so to be continued.
yes.
So looking at your graph, this is from the first portion of the presentation. It seems like you get very high monarch abundance in low milkweed density. What do you think could explain those outliers? Is there some good practices to garner from these sites? Is there anything done in those sites that might explain the higher monarch abundance?
Yeah, I think potentially, like there are other factors such as the size of the site, but also floral resources potentially. We did look at floral density and um, richness as well, and there wasn't a significant effect, but it could be that because we were looking at foraging monarchs, although uh, there are monarchs in the sites with more milkweed. There are also monarchs being found in the sites that maybe have less milkweed but do provide floral resources. It's hard to
Mhm.
totally um, figure out what that might be, but yeah, that's could be a possibility.
Yeah. Did you, were you able to distinguish between male and female? Did you look at that in the field or just
No, because it was just for foraging.
yeah.
So that, but for future studies, that would be more interesting to look at. And it could be, there are some other questions we were curious about with foraging. So we were looking at foraging monarchs, but this could be done with all monarchs, no matter if they were foraging, and with the sweep netting as well to capture them and like identify whether they were male or female, and that could have
Mhm.
an effect. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if the females are going more to sites with more milkweed than the males who are more focused on the nectar.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Next question. I know that results on where to restore is still evolving, but in your opinion, are there any contraindications to restoring monarch butterfly habitat in urban or disturbed areas? This kind of goes back to the previous question that we were talking about.
Yeah. I still am. I don't have results for this yet, so I still am not sure based on like this specific study, but I would say um, I think that all pollinator garden habitat restoration projects are beneficial, but there is the added risk of um, creating this ecological trap because of the roadways. So yeah, I think some more like road mortality studies and studies of specifically like urban pollinator gardens would be interesting. Um, yeah.
Okay, perfect. That leads into the next question. So, how long does it typically take for an environment to become restored? And is this something that you would recommend on the scale of urban gardens?
I would say based on these projects, the most recent one that we had looked at was from 2022. Um, and so at that point, that was 2 years prior, and there were uh, many floral species and milkweed species as well. Some of the sites were a bit older from 2017 um, that were quite similar as well. So I think having a season or two to plant and to grow, and it depends on the amount of maintenance also. So I know that some of these sites have had some invasive species removal or other maintenance done, while others have not. For an urban location, I think I'm actually working on putting together a pollinator garden on the University of Ottawa campus right now. So I'm kind of in a process of figuring that out. But I think a season a season or two to plant and then also have that regrowth as the seasons go on.
Mhm.
And it depends on how much maintenance you put into it as well. And I think for urban areas, it also depends on like the quality of area that you're planting. So if it's in a park versus it's more of like a sidewalk bed, there might be some issues that you run into with that in terms of um, getting it up to a restoration project standard, sort of.
Mhm. Yeah, okay. And a nice comment, they would love to read your research. So, is there a way that we can read the whole thing?
I don't have anything out right now, but I do have a blog article that I wrote for the Nature Conservancy of Canada, so that is available online. I'm not sure if we can send that out
Yeah,
after the fact, but I think it would be wonderful if I were to be able to write another one once the results of my second project come out as well. And of course, eventually publishing as well. But yeah, I'm always keen for opportunities for science communication, etc. So yeah.
awesome. Yeah. So we'll stay in touch and up to date and share with the network as you
Yeah.
find out more. Next question, going back to the Monarch tagging, what is the margin of error, the distance error for spatial detection of the tags?
Ooh. I actually don't know that one off the top of my head. I wasn't specifically myself looking at the nitty-gritty of the tagging data after the fact, but yeah, I can figure that out and
Okay.
get back to you depending
Okay,
on who was, yeah.
great. And for the foraging surveys, did any non-milkweed forbs stand out as more preferred for nectar sources?
It's hard to identify preferred. There were certain species that were foraged from far more, but then you also have to consider like control for the like initial density of that already. So I think from what I've seen, I haven't done any specific analyses on this at this point, but generally observationally the species that were foraged from more, such as Virginia mountain mint and wild bergamot, they were also highly abundant. So I would say those are generally species that were foraged from more, but I don't know if it's hard to indicate a preference or even
Right.
if there's anything to do with um, anything other than they were just mostly what was available.
Yeah. A question about goldenrod. Did you have a lot of monarchs foraging on goldenrod?
No, only a few.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm interested to go back. You mentioned that different sites had different levels of invasives and non-native plants. Did
hmm
you look at the impact that that had on monarch butterfly foraging, if there were sites with more natives or non-natives, or non-native versus natives, did that have an impact on how the monarch would forage on it?
No, we haven't looked at that, and I think it's mostly there were not that many sites that had invasives, and like what I picked up in the surveys, there were only a few. So considering native versus non-native, because there are these restoration projects, they're like the majority of the flower resources are native. So it was, yeah, not necessarily able to do a full analysis to
Yeah.
see, but
Okay. A question just came in. Are there any citizen science initiatives underway using the Project Monarch app for tracking the tagged monarchs?
as far as I know, there's not necessarily any citizen science initiatives with that. I mean, the app is publicly available, which I think is amazing, and you can see where these monarchs are going. Um, you can help in the tracking by having Bluetooth on your phone, but because the tags are a bit pricey, it's less of a um, community-based monitoring thing, and I would say more if people who have more funding would probably be purchasing the tags and tagging, but I think that having communities sort of participate by being a part of the app and monitoring, that's, yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. And then just a comment that came in for you and for other attendees as well. If you're looking for free native plant seeds for a pollinator garden, you could contact the Ottawa Wildflower Seed Library for help, and also the Butterfly Way project, which is a nice resource to have. That's all the questions that we have for now. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, or we can wrap up the webinar for today?
Yeah, no, thank you guys all so much for joining and listening to me talk about the research. I was super happy to share it all. And yeah, if you're interested in hearing more, there's the Nature Conservancy of Canada article that I wrote. Yeah, would love to hear
Awesome.
if you have any more questions or comments later on.
Great. Yeah, we'll keep in touch and we'll share your results when they come in
Yes.
with the group. Okay. Thanks, everyone.